Alice had always been a woman of faith. She grew up listening to the gentle hymns from the small church at the end of the street, learned from her mother to kneel before bed, and as a child believed that God could hear even the faintest of whispers. Now, at 33, she lived in a modest little house in a small town with cobbled streets and neighbors who knew each other by name. She was married to Leonardo, a soft-spoken, calloused-handed salesman, and mother to Davy, a 6-year-old boy who not long ago would run barefoot through the yard with sparkling eyes. But in recent months, Alice's faith had been put to the test. Leonardo's work barely brought in anything. The bills piled up in the kitchen drawer, and to make matters worse, Davy had started showing strange symptoms, recurring fevers, unusual fatigue, sunken eyes. The doctors couldn't say for sure what it was. They ran tests and asked for patience, but a mother's heart was tired of waiting. That Sunday morning, Alice woke to the soft light seeping through the cracks in the curtains. The birdsong sounded different, almost like a reminder that the world outside kept spinning, indifferent to the silent chaos inside her chest. Leonardo was still asleep, exhausted from yet another fruitless week of work. She got up quietly, trying not to wake him, and headed straight to the kitchen. She made coffee with the mechanical focus of someone no longer moved by the smell, and stood at the window, gazing at the yard where Davy used to play. A knot formed in her throat. "Lord, do you still hear me?" she thought, almost in a whisper. She was so weary from searching for answers and finding nothing but silence. She prayed every night with sincere faith, but each morning brought the same feeling, that she was alone in a void that hurt more than any diagnosis. She was interrupted by the phone ringing. It was her mother, Donna Teresa, who lived about 50 kilometers away. She asked how they were and invited the family to come visit the following weekend for a small gathering to celebrate Alice's grandfather's birthday. With a tired smile, Alice said she'd think about it. Maybe a change of scenery would be good for everyone. After hanging up, she stood still by the table, feeling the weight of not knowing what to do, where to go, how to act. She closed her eyes and prayed again, this time without words, just letting her heart speak. A Bible verse came to mind. "Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near." Isaiah 55:6. Was she seeking the right way, or was she so restless inside that she couldn't hear God's voice, even when he was speaking? A little while later, Davy woke up. He was pale, with deep circles under his eyes and a worn expression. Alice made him a glass of orange juice and encouraged him to drink, trying to hide her worry. He took a few sips and asked, "Mommy, we're going to church today, right?" Alice smiled with a tenderness she had to force. "Yes, sweetheart. We'll get ready soon." Leonardo woke up shortly after, took a quick shower, and dressed in silence. He had been quiet lately, carrying worries he didn't always share. Sometimes Alice wanted to ask how he was really doing, but she was afraid of the answer, afraid to find out he, too, was losing hope. The three of them walked to church. The small, white-walled building with wooden pews was the only place where Alice felt her heart could breathe a little lighter, even if only for a moment. During the service, the pastor spoke about how God's answers don't come in our time, but in his. He said that sometimes the delay is actually an act of love, a preparation, a process, a maturing. Alice listened, but her heart still bled. "Is this really for me, Lord?" she thought, trying to hold back her tears. She looked at Davy, drowsy and curled up next to her, then at Leonardo, whose eyes remained fixed on the altar, perhaps hoping to find some direction. When the service ended, Alice left with a light sense of relief, but not enough to calm her anguish. She was still waiting for a clearer sign, something that could say without a doubt, "Yes, I'm here, everything will be okay." But the sky, that day, remained silent, and silence sometimes felt deafening. The next morning, Leonardo left early to visit some potential clients around town, determined to make at least one sale, however small. Alice stayed home with Davy. who still looked tired but had no fever. After making breakfast and tidying the little kitchen, she heard a knock at the gate. Opening it, she saw a serene-faced woman dressed simply, holding a Bible in her hands. "Good morning, my dear. May I talk to you about the Word of God?" Alice hesitated. She already went to church, but her heart was too weary for more promises that felt unfulfilled. Still, there was something in that woman's presence, a calmness, a sweetness in her gaze, that made Alice leave the gate slightly ajar. "Maybe just for a few minutes," she said, almost against her will, as if part of her resisted while another part desperately longed for any sign from above. The woman introduced herself as Marta and explained she wasn't from town. She belonged to an itinerant evangelism group and, for some reason, had felt drawn to walk that street that day. "You know, sometimes God sends us where someone is waiting for an answer," she said gently. Alice swallowed hard and invited her in. She offered her a glass of water and, without realizing it, began to open up. She spoke of sleepless nights, Davy's fragile health, the mounting bills, the feeling of praying in vain. Marta listened attentively, nodding occasionally. When Alice finished, she felt both relieved and exposed, as if she had left her heart too bare. "I understand, my dear," Marta said, her voice firm yet full of love. "Everyone has their cross, and sometimes it feels like God has gone silent. But He is listening, and in His time, He acts." It wasn't a magical answer or a divine revelation, but her words settled in Alice's chest like a warm breeze on a cold winter morning. After Marta left, Alice stood still in the middle of the room, staring at the door still slightly ajar. The visit had been brief, but it left a trace of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if God had answered her prayer, not with an immediate miracle, but with a presence that reminded her she was not alone. That same day, Leonardo returned home later than usual, tired and sweaty. They sat down for dinner and began to talk about their day. He shared how a woman had welcomed him kindly, listened to his sales pitch, and even bought a few products. She said something strange, that sometimes God lets us go through valleys, so we'll learn to look up. Upon hearing that, Alice looked at him in silence. She then told him about Marta and the words she had shared earlier that day. The couple exchanged a look, as if for the first time they could see the outline of a greater plan. Were these coincidences, or was God trying to speak to them in a gentler way? In the days that followed, life continued with its usual weight. Leonardo kept struggling with sales, and Davy had another feverish episode during the night. They rushed to the town's hospital, where, once again, the tests revealed nothing conclusive. The attending doctor recommended seeing a specialist in another city, but the costs felt impossible. Alice returned home, feeling defeated. After putting her son to bed, she locked herself in the bedroom and broke down in tears. It was too much for one person to carry. The pain, the uncertainty, the constant fear of losing what she loved most. She fell to her knees by the bed and, for the first time in a long time, did not pray with polished words. "Lord, I'm at my limit. If you can hear me, please, any sign. I just need to know I'm not speaking into emptiness." And in that thick silence of the room, something unexplainable happened. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a vision. Just a subtle, discreet peace, almost imperceptible, yet it rooted deep in her soul like a silent promise that everything would be okay. The following week, they remembered Alice's mother's invitation to visit the neighboring city for her grandfather's birthday party. Despite their weariness and uncertainty, they decided to go. Maybe a change of environment would help Davy and themselves breathe new air. They drove along a road lined with tall trees and peaceful landscapes. In the back seat, Davy seemed calmer, fever-free for a few days now. Alice watched him through the rearview mirror, offering silent prayers as the wind tousled his hair. They arrived at the grandparents' house by late afternoon and were greeted with tight hugs and warm smiles, the kind only family can give. Grandma Joanna, Alice's grandmother, insisted on showering them with her signature over-the-top affection. During the party, Davy even played a little with his cousins, albeit with less energy than usual. Leonardo took the chance to talk with some uncles about possible job opportunities, and Alice slowly began to relax, as if her body was remembering that there had once been a time before the pain, and that time, perhaps, could return. Later that evening, as the party quieted down, Grandma Joanna invited Alice for a private chat in the backyard. They sat on a wooden bench under the shade of an old mango tree. The grandmother held her granddaughter's hand tenderly and asked gently, "Sweetheart, tell me, how are you all really doing?" Alice hesitated for a moment, but the affection in her grandmother's eyes felt like a hug to the soul. So she shared everything. She spoke about Davy's uncertain health, Leonardo's discouragement, and the weight of carrying it all without knowing if God could hear her. Joanna listened quietly, gently caressing her hand, as if saying, "I'm here." When Alice finished, her grandmother took a deep breath and replied with the wisdom of someone who had lived long. "Enough to understand seasons of waiting. My dear, I've lived through many things, and I can assure you of this. God never stays silent out of cruelty. Sometimes He's just waiting for us to learn how to hear Him differently. The answer isn't always an immediate miracle. Sometimes it's a process, but He answers. He always answers." Those words fell like balm on Alice's soul. She remembered what she had heard at church, what Marta had said, what Leonardo had shared about the kind woman. All the messages had one thing in common. God was not absent. Perhaps He was just working in ways different from what she expected. And what if the answer really was coming little by little, in pieces? A gesture here, a bit of help there, a comforting conversation, a doctor who truly listened. Suddenly everything started to make sense, as if small fragments of hope were slowly coming together, rebuilding her faith. When they returned home after the weekend, Alice felt something different inside her. It wasn't euphoria or complete relief, but more like a seed, a quiet, discreet faith beginning to grow again. She was finally learning to see God in the details, in the encounters, in the perfect timing. On Monday, Alice took Davy to a new doctor, recommended by a friend from church. Dr. Ramon was different from the others. Instead of going straight to the tests, he sat down and listened carefully, asking about the child's routine, diet, habits, and family history. He wrote everything down, attentively. After a thorough examination, he suggested a specific set of tests to investigate possible autoimmune causes or food intolerances. "Let's take it step by step. But the important thing is that we're not going to stop until we find out what's going on," he said with a firm smile. Alice and Leonardo left the appointment with a new breath of hope. For the first time, they felt truly heard. But then came the worry. How would they afford such expensive tests without full insurance? Coverage? Reality once again threatened to crush the little moment of peace they had gained. And then something unexpected happened. Leonardo remembered a client he had spoken with a few weeks earlier, a kind man who happened to work at a clinical laboratory. He called him, explained the situation, and asked if there was any way to reduce the cost. To his surprise, the man not only offered to help, but also told him about a support program the lab had in partnership with a local charity. Through that, they were able to schedule all the tests at a significant discount and even received follow-up assistance. Leonardo returned home with his heart overwhelmed with gratitude. He told Alice everything, and she couldn't hold back the tears. It was yet another sign, maybe subtle, but still a sign. The sky seemed silent, but doors were opening, and she no longer doubted that an invisible hand was orchestrating every detail. The following weeks were full of activity. Davy underwent the tests, and finally the results brought a concrete answer. He had a rare food intolerance that triggered inflammatory reactions in his body. This explained the low-grade fevers, constant fatigue, and lack of appetite. The good news? It was treatable. With a strict diet and proper care, he could live well and thrive. As the doctor explained everything, Alice cried, but this time with relief. It wasn't the end of the struggle, but it was the beginning of the solution. She looked at Leonardo and saw the same, feeling in his eyes a mix of exhaustion, hope, and faith. The answer had come. Not as lightning from the sky, but as a quiet construction, day by day, piece by piece, through the hands of ordinary people in the form of small daily miracles that, together, made something extraordinary. The diagnosis marked the start of a new phase for the family. Alice dove into research about food intolerances, learned how to read labels like decoding secret codes, and started experimenting with new recipes to keep Davi's meals tasty and safe. The adjustment was not easy. Many common foods had to be replaced with more expensive, harder-to-find versions. But even with the challenges, Alice felt she now had a map, a sense of direction. She knew where to step. Every well-prepared meal, every fever-free day, brought a silent prayer of gratitude to God. Meanwhile, Leonardo doubled down on supporting the household. By day, he continued his door-to-door sales, and at night, he took up driving for a rideshare service. It was tiring, yes, but now he knew why he was fighting. Every sacrifice had purpose. Alice also began sewing again. It was something she had learned when she was younger but had let go over time. A neighbor asked her to hem a pair of pants. Another needed a zipper fixed, and soon the living room was filled with fabric, thread, and orders. She was surprised by how much joy it brought. Not just the extra income, but the sense of usefulness, of contributing meaningfully to the home. She felt alive, active. At night, when everyone was asleep, she would sit and sew with headphones on, listening to soft worship songs, as if stitching faith into each seam. Even in her exhaustion, there was peace. Life, once a wall without windows, was now a hallway filled with half-open doors. And with every effort, every step forward, Alice could see light growing at the end. Church became a different place for Alice as well. Before, she had gone to services carrying a heavy heart, always seeking immediate answers. Now, she went to give thanks, even without everything solved. She sat in the front rows, listened more intently, and slowly started connecting with other women in the congregation. They formed a small prayer group where they shared their struggles, victories, doubts, and faith. They were simple women, housewives, workers, some with stories even harder than hers. But all of them had something in common, a hope that refused to die. During the meetings, Alice heard testimonies that touched her deeply. Mothers who had overcome their children's cancer, couples who had rebuilt their marriages after betrayal, women who had found God in the midst of absolute loneliness. Instead of driving her away, it made her feel less alone. There was an invisible network of support, and she was part of it. One day, after a Sunday service, the pastor called Alice and Leonardo into his office. He wanted to know how Davi was doing and whether they needed any support. Alice told him everything. The diagnosis, the new routine, the financial challenges. The pastor smiled, placed his hands over theirs, and said, "Look at how God works." The answer came, not in the way you expected, but in the way he knew you could handle. Leonardo nodded in agreement. If someone had told me all this would happen like this, in such a short time, I wouldn't have believed it. It's like everything was orchestrated. The pastor then replied calmly, "Sometimes God speaks through thunder, but other times, he works like a gardener, planting, watering, waiting for the right time to bloom." They left in silence, but inside, they each carried a deep certainty. The heavens were no longer silent. God was speaking. He was moving, and now they could hear it. In the days that followed, Davy showed remarkable improvement. He had energy again, wanted to play in the yard, asked to ride his bike. Alice wept when she saw him running after a ball, hair tousled by the wind, cheeks rosy, eyes sparkling. Just like before, it was as if childhood had returned to his heart. Leonardo's business also started to grow thanks to word of mouth. Former customers began recommending him, and his sales increased. Bills, once suffocating, became manageable. There was still no surplus, but there was no more despair either. And that, to them, was already a miracle. Every night, gathered in the living room, they said a small family prayer. And in one of those prayers, Davy said with simple sincerity, "Thank you, God, because I'm better, and because Mommy and Daddy are happy." That sentence, so simple, felt like a divine seal over everything they had lived through. It was confirmation that yes, answers were coming, one by one, right on time. A few weeks later, Alice was surprised to see Marta, the woman who had knocked on her gate months ago. She spotted her in the local grocery store, instantly recognizing her serene walk and warm smile. Overcome with emotion, Alice approached and shared everything that had happened since that day. Davy's diagnosis, the changes in their routine, the small victories. Marta listened with misty eyes, her expression full of tenderness. "I haven't forgotten you, my dear. I've been praying for your family ever since that morning," she said, holding Alice's hands. That reunion stirred up all the feelings Alice had at the beginning of her journey. The fear, the doubt, the sense of abandonment, now contrasted with what she felt today, a matured, quiet, but steady faith. Marta explained she was part of a traveling evangelism ministry and often walked without a specific route, simply asking God to guide her to someone in need of a word. "That day, He led me to your street. Now I see why." They exchanged contact information and promised to stay in touch. Alice left the market with a light heart, as if she had recovered a forgotten piece of her own story. On the way home, she thought about how life weaves encounters in its own way, how unseen hands constantly thread the days, connecting loose points with threads of hope. A month later, she and Leonardo were in the hospital waiting room for another follow-up appointment with Dr. Ramon when they noticed a distressed couple holding a baby. The child was crying non-stop, flushed with fever, and the parents exchanged anxious glances. Alice felt a pang in her chest. It was impossible not to see herself in them. She stood up, gently approached, and asked if there was anything she could do. The mother, eyes brimming with tears, thanked her. They had been through several doctors and still had no answers. "Would you mind if I prayed for you?" Alice asked softly. The couple nodded. Right there in the waiting room, with the sound of hurried footsteps and announcements in the background, Alice closed her eyes and offered a simple prayer. She asked God to calm their hearts, to soothe the baby's pain, to bring light into their confusion. No spotlight shone, no divine glow came through the window. But the parents wept. They cried because they needed that word. They cried because they had reached their breaking point, and someone, unexpectedly, had shown them kindness. Afterward, they thanked her over and over. "We really needed a word of faith," the father said, holding his wife's hand. Back home, Alice told Leonardo what had happened. Thoughtful, he remarked, "You know, today you were martyr for someone." They both smiled, and Alice knew deep in her soul that this time she had become the vessel through which God's comfort flowed. Time passed, and with it, life found a new rhythm. David stuck to his new diet and no longer had the old flare-ups. He ran, played, and laughed more. Leonardo's business continued to grow, supported by loyal customers. Alice sewed more and more, taking orders from all over the neighborhood. She even began thinking of opening a small, formal shop. Just a simple studio, but hers. Saturdays were set aside for family activities, trips to the park, the library, or movie nights at home with popcorn and cozy blankets. These were simple moments, but they had been forgotten in the whirlwind of pain. Now, they treasured each one. And during one of those outings, Alice had another revelation, not from heaven, but from the earth. She watched a gardener planting seedlings in a bed. She observed how he dug holes, gently placed the seeds, covered them with soil, watered them, and moved on. It struck her deeply. She stood there for several minutes, transfixed. Then she whispered to herself, "That's it. Faith is like a seed. You plant it in silence, not knowing what will happen, and for a while it seems like nothing is changing. But unseen, something is growing underground, strengthening, taking root. Then one day, without warning, it blooms." That was her journey. She had planted prayers, watered them with tears, waited through pain. And one day, almost unnoticed, the answer began to grow. She remembered every stage, the silence, the lady at the gate, the kind doctor, the helpful neighbor, the church support. All of it was part of a divine cycle. And now, in front of that simple gardener, Alice understood the value of each step. She smiled quietly, the afternoon sun warming her face. The world was still uncertain, but she was not the same. She now knew God works even in silence, and that the greatest transformations often happen without noise. Just before Christmas, Alice received a letter. A plain envelope with shaky handwriting somehow stood out. Inside, she found a note from the mother of the baby she had prayed for in the hospital waiting room. The woman thanked her deeply for the prayer that day. She wrote that afterward, they sought out new tests, found a specialist, and their daughter was now undergoing proper treatment with positive results. The letter closed with, "You have no idea how your presence changed our destiny that day. God used you." Alice read the letter with trembling hands and tears in her eyes. It was impossible not to remember her own journey, how she was once the one begging for help, until someone showed up with a word. Now she was the one offering it to others. The prayer, the comfort, the faith, everything she once received, she now passed on. Inspired by this, Alice felt a burning desire to get more involved in the church's prayer ministry. She had already bonded with the women's group, and now she wanted to give more of herself. She spoke with Leonardo, who supported her wholeheartedly. She began visiting the sick, bringing food baskets, praying with struggling families, listening to painful stories with the empathy of someone who had lived through them. Each visit made her feel more connected to God, not through spectacular visions, but through the relief she saw in people's eyes, the comfort brought by a word. Leonardo also joined the church's outreach team. On cold nights, he handed out soup and blankets to the homeless, something he had never imagined doing. But now, he saw others, pain with new eyes. He realized that sometimes you are the answer to someone's prayer, a simple gesture, a hot meal, a sincere ear. Davy's health remained stable with the treatment. He still required care, but the crises were gone. No more sleepless nights or panicked hospital visits. He was growing well, adapting to his new diet easier than his parents had imagined. The family, though still financially limited, lived with more peace. They had learned to save, live with what was essential, and appreciate what once went unnoticed. Every time Alice received a new sewing order, she saw it as provision. Every sale Leonardo made, no matter how small, was celebrated. The struggles hadn't disappeared, but they no longer felt heavy. Faith hadn't erased the problems, but it had changed how they faced them. One night after putting Davy to bed, Leonardo asked, "Have you ever stopped to think about how much we've changed?" Alice smiled. "I remember when I thought God had gone silent," he replied. "And now we see he was speaking all along. We just didn't know how to hear him." Time went on. The routine settled, like dust after a storm. One Sunday night, the pastor invited Alice to share her testimony at church, not as a sermon, but as a real story of faith. Alice hesitated. She felt shy, insecure, but something inside told her to say yes. And so she did. The next Sunday, she stepped up to the pulpit with a pounding heart. Her hands trembled, but her voice, though shaky at first, soon steadied. She said she wasn't a preacher, didn't have theological training, but she was a woman who had lived a story with God. She spoke of tears, sleepless nights, unanswered prayers, and how, little by little, she began to see answers differently. She shared Davy's story, Marta's visit, the hospital prayer, the seeds that seemed invisible but eventually bloomed. The congregation listened in silence. Some cried, others clasped their hands tightly in their laps. When she finished, the church applauded warmly. Many people approached to thank her, saying they saw themselves in her story, that they too were in seasons of silence, and now understood that maybe God was simply preparing the soil. And so, Alice's testimony became a seed in others' lives. In every hug she received, she felt she was repaying what was once given to her. In the days that followed, neighbors came to her for prayer, advice, companionship, and she welcomed them with love. Not because she had all the answers, but because she knew what it was like to have none and still be held up. When she felt lonely, she remembered Marta. On days when her faith wavered, she thought of her grandmother's hand holding hers. On difficult nights, she remembered the child in the hospital. And she understood more and more that God's answers aren't always grand or loud. Sometimes they're as quiet as a letter, or a smile, or a peace that settles in the middle of a storm.